We live in a world of unpredictable forces, and sometimes they strike at us with devastating consequences. For as long as you can possibly remember, nature and humankind have been at loggerheads, often resulting in disasters that scar generations. Today, we'll be looking at 10 of these tragic events, what went wrong, and how they might have been prevented. 1. The Challenger explosion of 1986. We'll start with the tragic January 28, 1986 explosion of the Challenger's STS-51L mission. The general feeling about this space voyage was one of excitement and novelty. For months, it was hyped up as a beautiful first in the history of American space travel, as it would be the first time a civilian astronaut would be going into space. Her name was Krista McAuliffe, and she was a teacher. But little did she and everyone else know that this fairy tale was about to have the worst possible ending ever. Just 73 seconds after liftoff, tragedy struck. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in the sky, more than 46,000 feet above the Atlantic. School children watching the televised launch in their schools were beyond shocked. But for the families of the 7 astronauts on board, nothing could have prepared them for the pain of losing their family members in this ghastly accident. Eventually, after investigations, it was discovered that the crash was caused by the failure of an O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters, leading to the rapid disintegration of the shuttle. Engineers had already warned about the risks, but with all the hype surrounding the liftoff, especially with the civilian astronaut coming on board, their concerns were hardly paid attention to. A simple delay would have resulted in a very different outcome. But unfortunately, all astronauts on board lost their lives, and the American space program was put on hold for the next 3 years. 2. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986. That same year, elsewhere in faraway Ukraine, a similar tragedy occurred. This time it was at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a key part of the Soviet Union's energy production. It was business as usual until a late-night safety test went horribly wrong. Next came a terrible explosion that resulted in the immediate death of 2 workers and the release of dangerous radiation and chemicals into the atmosphere. In the first 3 months after the explosion, 28 of the firemen and emergency cleanup workers lost their lives to acute radiation sickness, and 1 to cardiac arrest. Another 200,000 people were forced to relocate as a result of the accident. Eventually, it was found out that the operators at the power plant made a series of mistakes while trying to simulate a power outage. Safety systems were shut down at low power, and as a result, a power surge occurred, causing the number 4 RBMK reactor to overheat and melt down. Things were worsened even further as the facility lacked a containment structure, leading to a steam explosion and fire that destroyed the reactor building and released large amounts of radioactive materials, including plutonium, iodine, strontium, and cesium into the atmosphere. 3. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912. But even further back in time, we have the tragic sinking of the Titanic. A literal marvel of modern engineering in its day, the Titanic stood at over 882 feet long and weighed 46,000 tons. When it set sail in April of 1912, it was the biggest ship in the world. A White Star Line product, this vessel was the pinnacle of luxury. Grand staircases, lavish dining halls, and even a swimming pool. On April 10th, the Titanic set off from Southampton, England to New York City with over 2,000 people on board, including real estate magnate John Jacob Astor IV. The first few days of the cruise were uneventful until the night of April 14th. Near midnight, lookouts spotted a huge iceberg in the ship's path, and although the crew tried to steer away, it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the side of the ship, ripping open several compartments below the waterline. Initially, many passengers didn't even know anything had happened, but soon water began filling the ship. Barely 3 hours after hitting the iceberg, the Titanic split in half and disappeared into the Atlantic. 1,500 people lost their lives. Was all of this avoidable? To a large extent, yes. Multiple factors were to blame. For one, the Titanic had been traveling far too fast in an area notorious for icebergs. Also, the wireless radio operators had ignored iceberg warnings from other ships. Also, there were only lifeboats for about half of the passengers on board. Had more care been taken, the damage would have been seriously mitigated. 4. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. Now a bit more recently is the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. This was a state-of-the-art offshore drilling rig owned by Transocean and leased by BP. At the time, it was drilling an exploratory oil well called Macondo, some 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The well extended some 13,000 feet beneath the seafloor, so it was risky but also highly rewarding. By April 20th, the work was already nearing completion, and it was time to start sealing the oil well. But while the crew was doing so, a surge of highly pressurized methane gas shot up from the drill pipe. The gas ignited almost immediately, and in a short while, Deepwater Horizon was engulfed in flames. Despite the crew's best efforts at controlling the flames, the rig sank 2 days later, leaving oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico. 11 workers had already lost their lives, but the damage had only just started. For the next 87 days, nearly 60,000 barrels of oil spewed into the ocean every day. It wasn't until July 15th that the well was finally sealed. But by then, serious damage had already been done to marine life, coastlines, and local economies. But in all honesty, this could have been prevented. Although they were facing unstable well conditions, the crew were in a hurry to finish, since every extra day cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So BP and its contractors ignored warning signs of unstable well conditions, while also cutting corners to reduce costs. Eventually, they faced multiple fines, as their shady moves resulted in the largest offshore oil spill in America's history. 5. The Hindenburg disaster in 1937. Up next, we have one of the most devastating tragedies of the 1900s, one that changed the face of the aviation industry forever. In 1936, the Germans launched the largest ever passenger airship, the Hindenburg. 804 feet long, it was almost the size of the Titanic. A symbol of exuberance, the plane had elegant dining rooms, comfortable cabins, and even a smoking lounge, which was probably a bad idea since it was filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas. It quickly became the pride of German aviation, capable of flying across the Atlantic in just a few days. There was a snag, though. The Hindenburg used hydrogen instead of helium, and that proved to be its undoing. A year later, on May 3rd, she left Frankfurt for a 3-day journey to Lakehurst, New Jersey. But just as the Hindenburg was about to land, flames erupted near the rear of the ship. In 34 seconds, the airship had already collapsed into a flaming heap. There were 97 people on board, and only 62 of them survived. Multiple conspiracy theories have been put forward, with some even claiming sabotage. But one thing that's certain is that the Hindenburg's flammable hydrogen design made it extremely vulnerable to fire. If only they'd used helium instead, this just might have been avoided. But at the time, only America had access to helium and refused to ship it to the Germans for political reasons. Perhaps stricter landing procedures would have helped, but public trust in airships was already shattered, and that was the end of them, with aviation companies choosing to focus on making aeroplanes instead. 6. The Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. At number 6, we have the Fukushima nuclear disaster of 2011. In the late 2000s, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant provided power for millions of Japanese people. But nature had very different plans. On the afternoon of March 11, 2011, a massive 9.0 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. This was the 4th most powerful earthquake ever recorded and was named the Great East Japan Earthquake, or Tohoku. But the real trouble came with the tsunami it triggered some 40 minutes later. As soon as the earthquake happened, the plant's 6 reactors automatically shut down as a safety measure, but the ensuing tsunami was just too much for it. The intense floods swamped the plant, killing off the emergency generators. That meant there was no power for the cooling systems, and so the reactors overheated. Hydrogen gas built up inside these reactors, leading to multiple explosions in the following days. Radiation leaked all over the place too, forcing 150,000 people to evacuate. Despite the workers' best efforts at controlling the damage, things went out of control. So out of control that the disaster reached level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the highest possible rating. Now, while this was largely a natural disaster, the lack of proper planning definitely worsened things. For years, safety warnings from experts had been ignored, and the government officials were quite slow to respond. Also, the emergency generators had been placed in basements, so they got easily flooded, and the plant's seawalls were too low to block the tsunami. 7. The Mount St. Helens eruption. Up next, we have another inevitable natural disaster, because what do you do when a sleeping giant suddenly wakes up out of nowhere? Here's the story of the Mount St. Helens eruption. Located in the same state as the White House, Mount St. Helens is one of the most beautiful mountains in the Pacific Northwest, but beneath its breathtaking snow-capped peaks bubbled an active volcano. It stayed quiet for well over 100 years until March 1980, when a series of small earthquakes triggered an eruption. The signs were there. Magma was clearly rising underneath the mountain, yet scientists' warnings were largely ignored. Then, in the early hours of May 18, 1980, a 5.1 magnitude earthquake struck directly beneath the mountain, triggering the largest landslide in recorded history. The entire north side of the mountain collapsed, causing pressure on the magma inside. Then, a powerful eruption shot sideways at almost 700 miles per hour, flattening everything in a 230 square mile area. Ash debris darkened the sky for miles in 11 states. Lahars, or volcanic mudslides formed of melted snow, ice, and several entire glaciers, reached as far as the Columbia River some 50 miles away, burying whole towns and forests. The eruption was the most expensive in U.S. history, costing about $1 billion in damages. But even more saddening was the loss of life. Some 57 people were killed, not to mention the death of livestock and fish. To be fair, little could have been done to prevent the eruption, especially since most eruptions happen upward, and this one erupted sideways. Still, if people hadn't ignored the evacuation warnings, much more could have been salvaged. 8. The 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami. Next, we have the Indian Ocean tragedy of 2004. The Indian Ocean is arguably one of the most important oceans in the world, as millions of Asians depend on it for their survival. But underneath all the aquatic life lay a threat that was capable of taking lives. On Boxing Day of 2004, an undersea earthquake with a magnitude of 9.1 struck off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia. Although it was one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded, rupturing for over 900 miles, the real trouble had only just started. Over the next 7 hours, a tsunami triggered by the earthquake spread out across the Indian Ocean, devastating coastal areas as far away as East Africa. In some locations, the waves had reportedly reached a height of 30 feet or more when they hit the shoreline. Serious economic damage was incurred, but even worse was the massive loss of lives. The whole incident lasted 8 hours, and an estimated 228,000 people died as a result of the tsunami. Could this have been prevented? No, but the staggering loss of life could have been reduced. The government had been completely unprepared for such an event, so relief efforts were slow. And with the poor infrastructure, entire communities were swept away with barely any resistance. 9. The Great Chicago Fire, 1871. Back in the late 1800s, Chicago was a rapidly growing city, filled with opportunity, and so everyone wanted to be there. The only problem was, it was mostly made of wood, and when October 8, 1871 rolled around, this proved to be the city's Achilles heel. That night, a fire started in a small barn on DeKoven Street on the city's south side. Within minutes, the flames had sped across the city. By the next morning, the fire had already jumped the Chicago River and even burned the courthouse. It wasn't until Tuesday that rain put out the fire, but by then it had burned an area 4 miles long and 1 mile wide. The fire destroyed 17,500 buildings and 73 miles of street. 90,000 people, about 1 in every 3 Chicago residents, were left homeless by the fire. While only 120 bodies were recovered, it is believed that 300 people died in the blaze. Of course, no one knows exactly what caused the initial fire at the barn, but it's generally agreed that if the city's infrastructure had been made with less flammable material, things wouldn't have been so bad. Besides, it was October, so dry weather and strong winds meant the fire spread much faster. But had the fire department been more equipped, they could have slowed the flames. 10. The Space Shuttle Columbia Disaster, 2003. And finally, we have the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster of 2003. Now, before its tragic crash, NASA's Space Shuttle Columbia was the first shuttle to reach space in 1981. By 2003, it had already completed 27 missions. On the 16th of January 2003, the Space Shuttle launched its 28th mission, STS-107, a 16-day scientific research flight. However, the 7 astronauts on board didn't know that would be the craft's very last time entering space. On the 1st of February 2003, the space shuttle disintegrated just as it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, killing everyone on board. Questions were asked, investigations began, and it was discovered that just 81 seconds after liftoff, a piece of foam insulation had broken off from the external fuel tank and struck the left wing of the shuttle. NASA engineers had noticed but ignored it since it wasn't the first time something like this was happening. But this oversight proved awfully fatal. The crew, excited to be finally going back home, were oblivious of the hole the foam strike had left in the heat shield. Once the shuttle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, the damage allowed hot atmospheric gases to penetrate the heat shield and destroy the internal wing structure, which caused the orbiter to become unstable and break apart. Traveling at 12,000 miles per hour with this sort of internal damage, the craft easily fell to its tragic crash. A rescue mission could have easily averted this needless tragedy. Though it would have been nearly impossible for the passengers to fix the hole in space, they could have evacuated the astronauts to a new spacecraft. Also, had the hole been properly investigated, maybe, just maybe, things might have turned out differently. While these tragedies were beyond horrific, they taught a bitter lesson about the preparation. Valuable lives were lost due to some needless acts of oversight, and why the human species really needs to do better. But what did you think of all of that? Were there any of these tragedies you experienced? Let us know in the comments. Remember to leave your likes and subscribe too.